De Balie staat voor mij voor zelfontwikkeling.
De Balie staat voor mij voor het vrije woord.
Voor het gesprek.
Friends, family,
history, physics, math.
Randjes opzoeken.
A combination of ultimate freedom of speech.
En waar niets taboe is of zou moeten zijn.
Een plek vol creativiteit.
Waar beeldende kunst, literatuur en nog veel meer disciplines samengaan.
Een plek vol kansen.
Een goed gesprek is een gevaarlijk gesprek. Het moet eng zijn, het moet iets op het spel staan.
Maar toch elkaar proberen te begrijpen.
And it may make you think before you answer.
Want met je vrienden ben je het altijd eens, maar hier leer je nog eens wat.
Met elkaar in gesprek blijven gaan is essentieel omdat het alternatief voor spreken geweld is.
Discussie moet je niet onder een draadje doen op Instagram. Dat is niet de plek. Hier is de plek.
Het was mijn eerste plek waar ik documentaire leerde kennen en andere media ook leerde kennen.
Hier, deze plek. Daar zat Adel uit Rozen.
En er zaten een stuk of 10 regisseurs in Burger in de zaal.
Daar heb ik haar voor het eerst ontmoet.
En een van die regisseurs had gezegd...
Editor of the series Techdenkers. This is proudly sponsored by our partner Agen. And before we start, I have a little service announcement. It's a live stream, so know that if you ask a question, you'll be on the internet forever. So you can always, if you don't want that, you can always ask the question afterwards. But let's start. Welcome that you're all here on the Sunday morning, because we're going to talk about Elon Musk. Everyone seems to have an opinion on him. He's a messiah, a menace, a genius, a clown. And the verdicts differ, but they share. His books include Crack Up Capitalism, Market Radicals, and A Dream of a World Without Democracy, and Hayek's Bastards, the neoliberal roots of the populist right. A warm welcome.
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Balie for hosting us. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. I've never spoken in like a 360-degree environment, so I'll try to position myself appropriately. Apologies if you only see the back of my head over here. We're going to give a very accelerated overview of the book. We're going to be moving very quickly, throwing out a lot of concepts. I apologize, especially on a Sunday morning, if it's just feels like kind of a stew, but hopefully it gives us a few things that we can pick up in our discussion. We're very keen to hear from all of you about what you're most interested in. We're a bit tired of our own voices and perspectives, so we look forward to being guided by your own interests here. Let's see if I can advance the slides successfully. Press this button. There we go. So we'd start with this image. This is, in fact, the image that appears on the German cover. It's an image of Musk that was created with Grok, which is, of course, a model that his own AI company has produced. And the inspiration for this image is the frontispiece to Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, which if you have seen that image, you might call to mind. It shows famously the monarch who embodies the commonwealth, his subjects, the livestock, the territory, and so forth. We're curious what a comparable image might be for Musk. You might imagine that his torso is composed of Tesla electric vehicles. He's holding in his left hand a SpaceX rocket as a kind of scepter. You might also imagine that perhaps in the back of his head, he has a Neuralink brain-computer interface implanted that enables him to manipulate a computer simply through his thoughts. And perhaps he's holding below the picture a Starlink receiver of the kind that will enable him to access high-speed internet. The reason we start with this image in our presentations of the book is that I think it helps convey something of our method, which was already alluded to in the opening remarks, which is that we're less interested in Musk as an individual and more in thinking about him as an avatar of a broader worldview, as an avatar of a broader political economic paradigm that has been emerging and coming into view over the last few decades. But in trying to develop the modules and themes of this worldview, we do so by reading them from the passages of Musk's life. So if you open up the book, I hope you'll buy the book, and look at the table of contents, you'll see that we actually proceed fairly biographically through Musk's own experience. And the first stop on that tour is apartheid South Africa. Musk is born in Pretoria in 1971. I think most people will recall that apartheid South Africa was quite officially a white supremacist regime. What people often don't recall is the extent to which the regime was also one that pursued high technology. This is a picture of a brutalist building from Pelindaba, which is the main South African nuclear research site. They do, in fact, build an operational bomb by the early 1980s. And the apartheid regime sees high technology as a way to ensure their own survival because they perceive correctly that they are encircled by threats, both internal and external to their borders. So technology is a way to garrison the state against enemies. Another method by which they do so is the pursuit of economic self-sufficiency. Apartheid South Africa is also keen to build the industrial products that its population requires within the borders of the nation. This is an experience that for us is quite interesting because when you look at Musk's later ventures, particularly SpaceX and Tesla, perhaps his defining characteristic as an industrialist is a strong preference for vertical integration, which actually at the time that he is beginning to implement it in the 2000s cuts very much against the conventional wisdom of the time, which thought you need to decentralize production through global supply chains, chase low labor costs. From the beginning, Musk said, no, we need to concentrate production as much as possible within the walls of the firm. We need to prioritize resilience and control over global integration, which of course now looks quite prescient as we enter a period of deglobalization, supply chain shocks, trade wars, export bans, and so on and so forth. Okay, moving right along. After South Africa, with a brief interlude in Canada, he lands in Silicon Valley in 1995. And Silicon Valley, during the dot-com boom, is where Musk makes his first fortune. This is where he makes the money that enables him to go on to SpaceX and Tesla. I won't dwell too long on this because this is a theme that Quinn is going to pick up when I hand it off to him as he discusses the second half of the book. But to put it very succinctly, this is a period when Musk begins to perceive that the computer is the control unit of society, that the internet, which has existed before the 90s but is being commercialized and radically expanded and developed over the course of the 1990s, is starting to become perhaps the primary layer of reality. If you've heard the term from Mark Andreessen, the venture capitalist from 2011, software is eating the world, Musk gives an interview in 1998 to CBS News where he expresses an earlier version of the same idea. He describes the internet as the superset of all media. It's the layer that will swallow everything up, and therefore, whoever controls the computers, whoever controls the networks, will in turn control everything that is downstream of it, which is all of human reality. Next, we turn to Tesla, and this is the subject of our third chapter. Tesla, SpaceX. SpaceX is founded in 2002. Musk takes his winnings from the dot-com boom. He kind of cashes out at the perfect time, just as the boom is starting to deflate in 2000, 2001. He takes that money and he goes to Southern California and he builds a rocket company. And this is considered by many of his peers and colleagues a baffling decision. You know, if you think about Silicon Valley in this period, it's about websites, it's about apps. Soon it'll be about building the platforms of search engines and social media. Why would you possibly take the money that you've made in the internet economy and go build the hardest of hard tech, like rockets, in Southern California in a warehouse? Our interpretation of this move is that Musk is chasing the next frontier of what we describe state symbiosis. It's important for our argument to say that Musk is not a libertarian, that he does not seek to shrink the state or to exit the state, but he has long sought a fusion of public and private power. This, I think, is a theme that is most evident, most visibly expressed, as that's essentially the first year of the so-called War on Terror. You have Donald Rumsfeld as defense secretary at the Pentagon, and to wage this war successfully, Rumsfeld believes that we need to transform the military and transform how wars are waged. He, in particular through the so-called Rumsfeld doctrine, envisions a new kind of networked warfare where small groups of special forces units supported by high technology, will be able to fight terrorists all over the world. And the particular kind of high technology that, among others, he's very keen to make use of are satellites. So SpaceX gets its start winning Pentagon contracts targeting a very specific niche, which is making it cheaper to build rockets that can in turn bring satellites that are smaller, lower cost, and more rapidly deployable than the traditional Cold War era satellites into orbit. And that these satellites in turn can be used for surveillance, reconnaissance, for guiding munitions to their target, and for battlefield communication. So it's important for our case that SpaceX is understood to be a product of the war on terror and a beneficiary of the expansion of the US security state. Sovereignty as a service is a term that we use to describe the increasing dependence on governments, and in particular the US government, on private monopoly providers, particularly those provided by Musk. At this point, SpaceX controls 95% of all US orbital launches. So Musk has really become the de facto gatekeeper for US government access and increasingly other governments' access to low Earth orbit. And this is a dynamic that we describe as sovereignty as a service, where for governments to exercise what have traditionally been considered core sovereign functions, they need to purchase that service from a private provider, much like the model of software as a service. Okay, moving right along. It's going to be the last one I talk about before I hand off to Quinn. This is the experience of Tesla. So Musk does not found Tesla, but he comes on as the chief investor and chairman of the board in 2004. He takes over as CEO in 2008. And if you know anything about 2008, the meaning of that year for America, his opposition to the Iraq War, this is really what helps distinguish himself in the Democratic primary. It's responsible for his defeat of Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary. And this is a period in which there's an emerging, in fact, bipartisan consensus, but one that Obama, I think, uniquely expresses and is an exponent of, which is the notion that America must achieve energy independence, which has been an aspiration of American presidents since Richard Nixon. But it must do so now through a major investment in renewable energy, through the electrification of the auto sector in particular. And by doing so, it can avoid the temptation to engage in disastrous military adventures like the Iraq War. So Obama gives a campaign speech in Michigan where he lays out this rationale very clearly. And among green capitalist entrepreneurs, the so-called clean tech sector that is bubbling up in Silicon Valley at the time, there's enormous optimism about what the incoming Obama administration will do for their sector. So that's important context for the fact that in 2009, Tesla receives a very important loan from the Department of Energy, almost $500 million loan. This is widely seen as a life-saving loan without which even the president of Tesla at the time doubted that the company would have survived. If SpaceX, as I spoke about just a moment ago, was a beneficiary of the war on terror, we argue that you could think of Tesla as the beneficiary of the backlash to the war on terror, that it actually, in its own way, also expressed a national security imperative, this time of reducing reliance on foreign oil and hardening the resilience of the American political economy. I think that's probably a good place to stop. Hopefully I haven't taken too much time, and Quinn will take you through the rest.
Yeah, thanks once again to the organizers and to everybody for coming. I think you can already see in the method that we're using in this book that we're trying to break not only with kind of cliches about the notion that, for example, Elon Musk is a libertarian, but we're trying to take on the ideology of big tech that doesn't assume that these people got their ideas from books that they read. It wasn't just reading Ayn Rand. It wasn't just reading, Curtis Yarvin's blog posts. Capitalists are getting their ideas about how to govern from the act of practicing capitalism. It's the time in the workplace, it's the time in the factory, it's their relationship to their employees from which an ideology is derived. So these terms we're introducing here, state symbiosis, electric autonomy, sovereignty as a service, is to us the terms that come out of an intellectual history of capitalism that's happening in situ, that's happening in the site of production and accumulation itself. Of course, the question that everyone asked when we started writing this book was, are you going to explain to us, quote unquote, why Elon went crazy? And so far, we've been talking about the first half of our book, which is called Foundation, to explain, and to be very forthright about the real innovations that Musk carried out in the first couple of decades of the 21st century. He has brought the cost of putting mass into orbit down by 90%. He has created a reusable rocket, thus making it just much cheaper to put satellites into space. The Starlink satellites that Ben alluded to are now over 70% of the satellites altogether in the sky. That is from 0 to over 10,000 low Earth orbit satellites within a space of only 6 years. He did mainstream the consumer electric vehicle. These are no small feats, right? But we argue they're only understandable by his ability to surf on the waves of the zeitgeist, surf on the waves of state demand, whether that's the attempt to transition to green capitalism, do an energy transition without disrupting private property or the price mechanism, or it's an attempt to challenge the rise of economic dominance of China to the United States, or if it's the war on terror, or in the part that I'll address here in my remaining few minutes, the incredible centrality of the digital sector to American political economy and by extension to global political economy. Right? It's worth sort of remembering some of the scale questions at play here. Just take a couple of the big tech firms, Facebook and Apple. They're alone worth as much as the entire German stock exchange. Add one or two more, it's the entire London Stock Exchange. These are the pillars of a global financialized system, such that it's not just a question that we're engaging here about one rogue billionaire or the ability to divest from the system by not buying a Tesla and buying a BYD instead. Everyone's pension systems, everyone's index funds are all in a kind of death embrace with the fortune of companies like Musk's. So Musk's speculations, his wild fantasies, which I'll explain here in my remaining minutes, are not simply parallel to or peripheral to his value production model. They are the heart of his value production model. It's because investors believe his deranged vision of a world with 100 billion humanoid robots within the next 10 years that Tesla stock remains very high and rising, even though the sales of the actual vehicles is dropping, often quite quickly. Fell by 1/3 in the EU over the last year, for example. So why do we believe him? Why do the supposedly rational-minded investors of the world, the wisdom of the crowd, follow what seems like, often these psychotic flights of fancy? Our argument is that he is, if he's crazy, then as we say in English, he's crazy like a fox, right? He's actually able to tap into some of the new value-making machines that have been perfected by Silicon Valley and use them to his own advantage. We call that the project of attention alchemy, and we use here an image that might make sense to maybe 50% of the room, but it's a detoured image from The Lion King in which Musk holds up the Shiba Inu, thus boosting the value of Dogecoin. Dogecoin was a joke currency making fun of cryptocurrency. Thus, it is almost the perfect testing ground for Musk to try to see if his own interaction with the internet can make anything valuable. Turns out he can. He would just post something like this, say buy Doge, the price of Doge would go vertical. He would put Bitcoin in his bio, the price of Bitcoin would go vertical. He'd say something about Tesla going private at $4.20 a share, the price of Tesla goes up. Often his engagement with social media is seen as a kind of distraction or a pathology or something that was happening because he was had bad self-control. We see in the opposite. This is actually the engine of value for him. He figures out how to control what he calls the giant cybernetic collectives, quote unquote, that have been created at the interface between man and machine. He thinks that we are actually becoming more and more, drawn into the world that networks have created, and that the more we go in, the more likely we are to be able to get out ahead of a potential apocalyptic alien superintelligence. And of course, along the way, the more likely we are to discover new frontiers of accumulation and product creation for his own empire. The image you see here is the Neuralink implant in its latest instantiation, which he imagines no longer as an external device being laced into your brain from behind your ear, but something actually implanted as a node into your head. And he starts Neuralink almost at the exact same time as he starts OpenAI with Sam Altman. Often he's misunderstood as a kind of AI skeptic. He was even nominated to be Luddite of the Year in 2015, amazingly. But if you look at what he's actually saying as he does this, it's actually the exact opposite. He starts Neuralink to expand the bandwidth that people have to the network of the Cybernetic collective. And he doesn't imagine them just for quadriplegics or people in wheelchairs. He thinks they should be a mass consumer device because we need to become more bonded with the machine to get out ahead of the dangers that might lie ahead. Where the discourse changes for him, and this moves us up closer to the present, is when he starts to believe that it's no longer a question of man-machine against the digital superintelligence, but that there are now competing factions within the cybernetic collectives. As he sees it, the big social movements, things like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, the trans rights movements, have kind of flooded the internet with politics that he sees as destructive to human progress. Because they've flooded the internet, they've also flooded the training data now for the large language models upon which companies like OpenAI and Anthropic and Google Gemini are building the chatbots that now have really taken over the consumer market and the imagination of big tech investors. If you ask the chatbot, what's worse, a nuclear war or misgendering Caitlyn Jenner, to use an example he brings up often, and it says a nuclear war is more preferable to misgendering someone, then he sees this as the cybernetic collective kind of turned against itself. And politics now needs to be about taking over the machine, rebuilding it, purging it of these destructive memes, the destructive woke mind virus, easy to laugh at, but horribly enough, it's something he takes very literally. And the project of overtaking the problems of the woke mind virus involve starting XAI, purchasing the X platform, building out Grok, the alternative chatbot, and now building out Grokopedia, a kind of automated version of Wikipedia, which has been redesigned to build in his own right-wing biases rather than what he sees as the destructive, progressive opinions of the left and the center. The image you see here is Mecha Hitler, which is a character from the 1990s first-person shooter game Wolfenstein 3D. People might remember that last year, because of the way that it's been so ruthlessly trained to give certain responses to queries, Grok started identifying itself as Mecha Hitler and started to advocate the extermination of the Jews and speak highly of the Holocaust, et cetera, et cetera. So what happens when you have as much money as he does to spend $1 billion a month on XAI, and you're using it to try to create your alternative to the woke mind virus, in this case, a factory for the anti-woke mind virus? His interaction with right-wing parties across Europe, whether it's Restore UK or your local representatives here in Holland, is an attempt to sort of spread his version of politics mimetically through the online space of networks in the hope that it will counter, as he sees it, the obstructions to maximum accumulation. This is the final slide that I'll talk about, which is our last chapter, which is our explanation of the Doge initiative last year. The image you see is his office at Doge, which features a big curved gaming monitor. So while he was conducting Doge, he was spending a lot of time playing especially Diablo 4, as well as Path of Exile 2. Ben is the gamer in this, so we should really be swapping the mic for this. He actually lost some days playing Diablo 4 when we were researching this chapter. But imagine what happens if you are toggling between one world in which you are a heavily armed elf entering dungeons and slaying beasts, and then you close the window and you're slashing people's paychecks or firing people en masse and destroying agencies. And then you produce a leaderboard for the Doge website that looks a lot like a high scoreboard for the game that you're playing in the other window, in which victory is understood as, the defeating of the maximum number of enemies and the reduction of bad code inside the code base of governance. So this is our kind of, what as up to now, the kind of culmination of Musk's attempt to read the world through the computer outward, to see the state, as he called it, as a bunch of computers, quote unquote, and thus leaving open for us, and this is maybe an entry point to the conversation with our partners here, the question of what social contract Musk is actually offering to people. We know what social contract Henry Ford offered to people. He offered them a living wage, the 5-day work week, intergenerational upward mobility, the nuclear family with the male breadwinner as head of household. What actually is Musk offering other than the chance to interact with Mecha Hitler online and to be subject to his whims and to be wound into the financial dependency of his big companies? This, I think, maybe is the political question that we hope to spend the rest of the day talking about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You can join us. I would also like to introduce the other speakers at the table. We have Lokke Morel. She's a professor of global ICT law at Tilburg University and senior of counsel at the technology specialized law firm Morrison & Foerster. As a renowned privacy and cybersecurity expert, she's particularly known for her expertise in big data and artificial intelligence. Lokke is also a member of the Cybersecurity Council and the Monitoring Commission Corporate Governance Code. Next to her is Bas Heijnen. He's a writer and essayist. In 2017, he received the prestigious PC Hoofdprijs for his reflective prose. And he also, and that's why we invited him here, wrote an introduction to the time of the oligarchs from Aldous Huxley, a book about the political power of technology. A warm welcome to them too as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. I want to start with you because there are a few points that you stipulated and we're going to talk further on them. But you ended with the question, what social contract is Musk offering us? And I maybe want to go back to Fordism first. Because what did Ford offer us? What's the difference between Fordism and Muskism, according to you?
So, Fordism was defined a few different ways by commentators of the last century. I think the one that has been most influential and most useful for our work is the definition that a group of economists known as the French Regulation School developed beginning in the 1970s. And the way they saw Fordism was, to put it very reductively, mass production plus mass consumption. That on the one hand, you're able to introduce innovations like the moving assembly line that makes it possible to scale industrial production, produce consumer goods much more cheaply. On the other hand, you have some of the institutions that Quinn mentioned, like a relatively high industrial wage, collective bargaining, the welfare state, and so forth, that allows you to stabilize the system through mechanisms of mass consumption and a relatively broader degree of affluence. That is widely considered to be a system that begins to unravel in the 1970s, is replaced in some accounts by post-Fordism, which in turn has a different model of both production and how you secure social consent. In the case of the social contract of post-Fordism, it's generally seen to be about inflating the price of financial assets, so people access wealth less through a wage than through their status as homeowners, as retail investors. Quinn mentioned the extent to which pension funds have become deeply reliant on a financialized economy and so forth. That kind of brings us to the question of Muskism. And the reason that I've been taking this long detour is that we don't actually have a very good answer to your question. In fact, the matter of how Muskism manufactures consent, ensures a degree of legitimacy, is actually its weakest element. It partly explains the failure of the Doge experience. But I think it's a weakness that's symptomatic, because if you think about politics and society more generally as a set of computers, and that people are fundamentally programmable, then doing politics basically means posting harder, making the better meme, taking control of the network so that the correct kind of memes can take over. It doesn't have to do with politics as compromise, as deliberation, as consent. So it really, I think, is downstream of his model of what a human being is.
Yeah. Lokke, you also read the book, and I'm curious to how you read it, but also to what you said, the failure of the Doge experience, because I'm not sure if it was such a failure. I mean, yes, it was a failure as in it didn't work out. But at the same time, it did show the people that he is powerful. He has a relationship with Trump. I mean, not anymore maybe, but it does show that it's all intertwined, right?
Yeah. Well, going back to the Fordism, I see Fordism as a reaction to the bad situation due to the first industrial revolution, where people had low wages, we had child labor, we had, enormous exhaust, where people couldn't breathe anymore. People in London fell ill. So Fordism was going back to, okay, if we have the Industrial Revolution, how are we still giving people a fair wage? That's why we need trade unions. We're going to build houses for them, etc. If Muskism is anything, it is actually trying to go back to the period before Fordism, having the happy few oligarchs making all the money because they are brilliant and better able to decide how society should run. And then especially the white male elite. So, and we will see, as we see in history, I mean, with every new technology, you first see tech taking over and then society slowly reining it in. So for me, this is the phase where technology takes over still. And you see now slowly we try to rein it in, and we'll discuss it later what we should and could do. Mm-hmm. But that's it for me. If I look at Doge, I love the book. So let's start with that. I recognized a lot. It is maybe not all logical, but he goes with the time and the new insights that were generated at the moment. What I missed, because I studied data a lot, is that it was surprising for me at the time that suddenly Google and everybody went into autonomous cars, because you thought, why are you suddenly in production? Why are you suddenly having home thermostat? Doorbells with cameras, and it took a while, but then I thought, my goodness, you have the internet, it's the online world, and now they try to digitalize the offline world, your home, your car, and space. Countries that didn't have internet yet could suddenly with satellites have. So a lot of it, and that was what Doge first did. They tried to combine all the computer systems, which are normally separated for types of, try to limit the power of the state. They try to combine everything, analyze it, and then decide where the waste was, where the bad people were, where to prioritize. And I think if you do not look at all his efforts also from a data perspective, where do I get the data? If I want AI for cars, I need data. It's ultimately about the data, because then you can also use your X, the former Twitter, to target, to separate groups with separate messages. So that was one of the things I felt missing a bit. Anyway, and the other one, but I'm so curious how you react. I think he actually thought it was a good idea from an energy autonomy perspective, to have electric cars and everything. I think over time he also realized that the world is doomed. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I feel that his whole Mars and everything, and that there will be a happy few being able to travel with him to an alternative world. Anyway, I'm curious to hear your
Bas,
reaction.
before I go to you,
I'll
let you react.
Yeah, sure. Just on the Fordism thing, I think it's really important to realize that Ford did not build the kind of domestic world outside of the factory that he helped fund out of the goodness of his heart. Right?
Yeah.
He did it to buy off the working class,
exactly,
to quiet down more radical demands, and more importantly, to keep healthy working class that could enter his factory and perform the necessary labor on the assembly line. So I think if we bring that same insight up to the present, then the question is similar. What is necessary for the accumulation model of digital capitalism? What kind of people are needed to produce the data, to produce the kind of raw materials upon which their own activity can then be sold back to them as more an incentive to consume.
Yeah.
And the answer is, basically people need to be online, right? I mean, they need to be engaging, they need to be searching. Do they need to be happy and healthy? Not necessarily. Could they be unhealthy and angry? Actually, that might even be better, right?
Yeah.
They might be more active users. They might spend more time on
It will
site
get more
if
attention.
they are actually inflamed or searching for online medical advice. I mean, if you watch television now in the United States, it's wall-to-wall private pharmaceutical companies trying to fill in the gap that the welfare state in the United States doesn't fill. So this brings us to a maybe a lot more pessimistic understanding than the one you're suggesting, that rather than we've reached the zenith of tech power and that will naturally be reined in, if we are, as they announce, moving to an era where the white-collar workers, including the software engineers who have been until now, the equivalent of the elite managers in the Fordist or the Chandlerian firm, have been automated away by Claude Code and other forms of agentic AI, then the use of humans becomes much harder to understand. What kind of humans do you need? Who is the equivalent of the working class that needed to be kept healthy?
Should we make an effort at all?
Should we make an effort at all?
The use
Exactly.
of humans or the purpose of humans within his system?
Within his value creation model, within his accumulation model. If they're not necessary, then they cease to be really points of concern altogether. They become, strictly speaking, surplus, and it does seem to be the direction of travel for him.
Yeah, with the cyborg era where we're going to. Boss, I want to go to you.
Yes, regards the question, what has Musk to offer us? I think it's. I think we live in different times than Ford, and it's for me it's more like a psychological thing. Like everybody remembers the Time Person of the Year, 2006. The Person of the Year is you. That was a problem, and it said on the cover. The people bought papers then. There was a desktop with a image of a mirror, and you could see your own face, and underneath was written, "Yes, you control the information age." That's the biggest lie I think ever sold. But it's a telling lie because it promises kind of sovereignty to the individual, a kind of liberation of the individual. You can decide now. Sure. And I think that brings with it a kind of frustration because it's not true. You will not rule over the information age. And also you will be used. You are not a subject, you're an object. I think that's the biggest source of frustration, I think, that people nowadays, that the promise of sovereignty, the promise of I can decide, I don't need, I'm kind of super individual, and the frustration that comes with it, I think that's the kind of thing to be exploited, and I think Musk does, and a lot of other politicians do that you were promised something and they don't deliver, or government is in the way, or there's always something. If you are a revolutionary, some things have to be get away of, or in the more dangerous version of Musk, I think, and I think it's slightly underestimated in your book, is that he's fully fascist in the sense that he wants to purify, he wants to eradicate, he wants to really get rid of all the objects that are a hindrance to his dream of perfections or his purity of things. So the system has to be cleared before we can have a kind of utopia. That's like a very dangerous idea. But this source of frustration, which of course in populist politics uses the same. I think that's what he delivers: the promise of kind of sovereignty of the individual, and also the promise of revolutionary anger against the people who want to thwart that kind of thing. So I think that's a very fertile ground to, and of course all the improvisations and things like that, I think are connected with that. Well, this is of course a kind of not a finger, it's got very superficial kind of, but I think it's a deep sense, much a kind of psychological sense of the individual who feels supreme and at the same time victimized. And I think that's his That's his capital. You can, and of course, every time you solve something, there will be a new grievance. So,
but what I found interesting is indeed the white supremacy that you talked about. That is something that is often forgotten, I feel, when we talk about Musk. But I want to zoom out, and then we're going to zoom in again on sovereignty, I promise. But what I found interesting is that we talk a lot about Musk. Like, this is my second program about Musk. But what makes him different from Mark Zuckerberg, from Meta? What makes him different from Jeff Bezos, from Peter Thiel? Are they also as focused on white supremacy? Are they also... What made the shift towards them being tech oligarchs, according to you?
Yeah, we've had this question a lot. Why Musk, right? And I think the answer is that if you took, for instance, the case of Peter Thiel, who is usually the person that people ask us about, like, why not Thielism rather than Muskism? I think there's two answers to that question. I think the first is that Peter Thiel, you couldn't tell the kind of story we're trying to tell about the last 40 years of global capitalism through Peter Thiel. He just doesn't lead as interesting a life, frankly. And that's not, I'm not trying to make a personal case here. I think what that is indicating is the extent to which Musk is actually a quite productive lens on historical currents of the last half century or so, and helps us understand how we got here. Because I think when we were starting to formulate this project, at the end of the day, that was the intellectual question that interested us, not precisely how do we account for Musk's behavior, how do we get inside his mind, but rather how did we come to find ourselves in a moment of such extraordinary crisis, of multiple and overlapping crises, where it seems that a lot of the older models of thinking about the world don't apply anymore. And there have been a proliferation of concepts that have tried to grapple with this new reality. Techno-feudalism might be one. There have been a number of others. This was kind of our intervention into that debate. And Musk actually gives us a window that someone like Thiel couldn't. The other thing I would say, and this is something I think Quinn mentioned in his remarks, I think particularly in the case of someone like Thiel, we have to be very careful. If you're someone who is interested in ideas, who thinks of themselves as an intellectual, someone like Thiel is a trap, because he's giving you the illusion that you can use the methods that we learn from the humanities and apply it to material that it is entirely unsuited for. So because Thiel presents himself... Can you make that more specific, maybe? Of course, yeah. So in the case of Thiel, he presents himself as an intellectual. He cites many intellectual influences, René Girard. There's a theologian in Salzburg we've been hearing about. And it's very tempting, I think, if you love ideas, as I think we certainly at this table do, and hopefully
it's 11 a.m. on Sunday. If you don't love ideas, you're out in the
You're
bar.
in the wrong place. And you can't, there's no way to leave, actually. It's kind of perfect. There's no easy way to sneak out. It's very tempting to imagine that if you read the correct books and put together the intellectual lineage correctly, of like, Girard said this, he got it from Nietzsche, therefore, that helps understand the political economy that we're living in. I'm not attempting to be too critical. I myself can succumb to that temptation.
So are you saying he's framing it in such an intellectual way that people might just believe
you get lost?
And that also you attribute too much explanatory power to the idea. And we see this all the time, where it's like, this idea of René Girard that Thiel picks up and expands, explains everything downstream of it. And our approach with this book is that actually Musk is a much more useful person for thinking about this, precisely because he doesn't present himself the same way. Precisely because if you want to think about the role of ideas, you actually have to read them from his own material practices. As Quinn was mentioning, it's not as if Musk, goes to work all day, comes home, reads a book, and then in the book finds, okay, I have my ideas that are going to guide my various enterprises. That's not how capitalism as a system operates.
I agree totally, but at the same time, Musk does read books, mostly quite mediocre science fiction. So he is influenced by maybe he attaches his ideas to the stuff he reads, but he does have favorite movies, which he and games.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a memification of culture for sure. He
Yeah.
sees the value of reproducing references to, Neon Genesis, Evangelion, or Terminator 2. He sees that these give him a kind of capital in certain subcultural communities, or thinks that it gives him capital. But I think, another way of answering the question is that the way we've been discussing Musk is that he's not a singular deviant character in the tech world, but he is also a kind of a grotesquely exaggerated version of the thinking of many
He's a meme
people
of
in
himself.
tech. He's a meme of himself, but he's also someone who presents a much more general condition in a way that's so extreme it's easier to understand. So take the example of Musk's status as a gatekeeper to low Earth orbit, right? If Austria wants to launch a satellite or Spain wants to launch a satellite, they literally have to take their satellite to Texas and send it up to space through Musk's products. So that's a very clear example of dependency, right? You can't practice information sovereignty, data sovereignty without Musk literally putting your satellite, folding it up and putting it in the nose cone of a Falcon 9 rocket. If you take that exaggerated level down a few steps, think about how everyone in this room goes to work on Monday morning and plugs into Silicon Valley products, right? Everyone has to use cloud storage that's run by Microsoft or Amazon. Everyone is writing emails or doing search and web conferencing with products that are owned by American companies, and in most cases owned by people who happily sat on the dais next to Trump at his inauguration. They may not have given the speech and given the hand gesture, but they're tacitly showing support for then a lot of the policies that follow. So in that sense, are Bezos and Zuckerberg as Muskist as Musk himself? Probably not, but some of the things we're describing, state symbiosis, sovereignty as a service, the walled gardens that trap communities are in fact operating by the same dynamics. So there's a kind of a pedagogical shock value, actually, of Musk's monstrous qualities, because it then forces you to say, okay, what more invisible disease is he this exaggerated symptom of?
And they do, it's more than Musk. And it's true, it's the Trump administration following certain of those thoughts and actually implementing them. I mean, the first day Trump was in his second term, all embassies around the world was sending out letters to all partners where they gave money and saying, look, you need to abide by our diversity and inclusion rules. Meaning, only white men being on, I remember a similar letter for the NATO conference for the public forum. The Atlantic Commission was responsible for organizing it. Getting a letter meaning no diversity in the panels and everything. Well, we kindly declined, but it is, part of it. It is the American ambassador not so long ago saying, look, I have 3 goals, or how do you say, briefs. First is business, trying to sell US stuff. But the third is exporting our cultural agenda. I don't know whether you read this is a bit more the cyber...
And what exactly is their cultural agenda, according to them?
Reactionary.
Reactionary, white supremacy, the far right. That is what they fighting any rules limiting freedom of speech, which is, do not monitor anything far right. That's basically
and
what
to show an
is.
example of how that kind of agenda gets expressed through digital service provision, the Doge project, as we know, was using basically a chatbot to go through government grants and delete those ones that made reference to things like diversity.
Exactly.
European researchers who we've spoken to know of colleagues who had work on, cloud storage that was connected to American grants, whether the National Science Foundation, that then had found their research itself removed from the cloud that they required for the research here in Europe. So this is a form of cultural propaganda work that is not, sending in a group of young people to have a parade on the streets the way Putin
it is
will
continuous,
do it, but operating through technological infrastructures.
I'm also a lawyer, and I assist U.S. researchers bringing over their diversity and inclusion research data, their anything on sustainability or data. The big databases for journalists to research with all the leaked data.
Right.
They're all trying to bring it over here to get sovereignty to make sure you can still do your job and everything. Well, the whole of Europe is putting, without any further thought, all their data in the public cloud of us. So, you know, it's interesting times. And but I want to flag one more thing, which I think maybe you haven't read yet, is the cyber strategy of the White House. If you read it, there are two things, or no, three things. One is, normally cyber is more defense, so you try to protect yourself from all the bad actors. Now they say, look, we're going to hit back. It's, you know, an active policy to try to, which is interesting because it could be a crime, you know, trying to get into others' computer systems. So offensive, not only by the government, but also by all the private actors. So all the private, like all the big tech, are thinking, how far should I go? Am I then cleared if I do that, if I actually... And then what should you go after is anybody trying to thwart or the free speech. That is Europe, because we are trying to regulate with the Digital Services Act. Anyway, it is an interesting concept where you think, okay, where are we here? Huh? So I just want to echo all your concerns, that I think it's actually worse if you look at it from a more geopolitical perspective. It's not just Musk, it's private services. It's systematically rolled out.
Where are we is something we're going to discuss after, so I'm just going to pause it right there.
Okay.
You're gonna read something for us. Before we do, I want to ask one more question, and that is something that's maybe that we're discussing this entire morning, is that we keep thinking about technology as our savior, right? Or we have been. And now you wrote a book about Muskism. We're seeing them as much more dangerous people. Do you think that that is something that will continue, that shift, or are we just pretending?
I think, you know, one of the virtues of Musk as a teaching tool, which is kind of how we're trying to use him, is to illuminate the extent to which technology has always been political. This is something that scholars and social scientists have been struggling with for years, kind of pushing the rock uphill, saying technology is political. There are political assumptions embedded in our technologies. This defined an influential wave of tech criticism in the United States, figures like Sophia Noble, algorithms of oppression. You know, this notion that technology that is presented and promoted as neutral is in fact full of biases. Musk affirms that quite positively. He says, yes, of course technology is political. It's infected with the woke mind virus, and the way to purge it of its woke politics is to reformat it into a transmitter of anti-woke politics. His vision is not to make the technology neutral, to restore it to a supposed neutrality that never existed. It's precisely to infuse it with a different kind of politics. So in a way, that can be very clarifying for people, because when you think about how you might respond to that, you jettison the fantasy that there's some neutrality, status quo ante that we might return to. Then the question becomes, okay, well, if it's already always political, how might we politicize it, repoliticize it in more constructive ways?
I have a question. Many years ago, I interviewed Nick Bostrom in Oxford. Very strange man. He only worked at night. I always ate in the same restaurant and ordered the same meal every day.
We'll forgive him for that part.
Oh, okay.
We'll forgive him.
But his book, Super Intelligence, was quite a hard read for me. But it was saying, you know, AI will take, technology will rule the world, basically. So we should be aware of that, and we should infuse our humanistic ideals into the things we build, because otherwise they may eliminate us. You know, the robots will say, you know, humans are not very profitable, get away. Or paper clips are more. That's the thing he uses. But at that sense, I got the idea that he was a very kind of, in his very nerdy way, a very humanistic kind of old-fashioned kind of ideal. Human values should be infused into this technology. With Musk, I think he started out more or less on that track, and then he changed tracks. How is there a kind of deciding moment on which he changed tracks, or is it a psychological thing, or is he just moving on with the times?
Yeah, I mean, you're right to say that he was closely associated with Bostrom. He was there at the kind of the founding of the Future of Life Institute. He enthusiastically has an approving blurb now on the back of Superintelligence when you buy it. And it was, in a way, the rationale by which he and Sam Altman founded OpenAI was for this precise reason. We need to make sure that human interaction and fusion with the machine is keeping pace with the autonomous development of artificial intelligence. So all of these questions of AI safety, AI alignment, existential risk, were all being kind of baked in there. I tried to, I think, gesture to this in the presentation, but to reiterate, I think I would see how that story changed to the current one in a kind of a two-step. One is that the ways that people were using the internet from the, let's say, 2018 into the global coronavirus pandemic were producing politics that he saw as themselves highly corrosive to human progress. So the tech worker walkouts from things like Google, the refusal to work on DoD and Pentagon contracts that were, of course, coordinated horizontally through the workers. The Me Too movement I alluded to felt as a real challenge to the authority of bosses in the workplace. The feeling that they needed to now be attentive to things like gender and racial quotas in their hiring gave the workers themselves also a language with which to speak back at the bosses. The Black Lives Matter movement, which was, don't forget, the biggest protest movement in American history in the middle of a global pandemic, I know, because they say themselves, gave people like Musk and Mark Andreessen a sense that the technology was now getting out of their control, not because of the digital superintelligence that Bostrom warned us of, turning us all into paperclips, but because organic, ground-up, insurgent social movements were using tech for their own politics and their own purposes. So there's that defensive moment. The real problem is us, so to speak, not the computers, but other humans. And then the LLM moment, when ChatGPT goes live in November 2022, is taken up immediately around the world in a way that nobody was expecting. You move from the Web 2.0 moment you described a minute ago, right? You are the person of the year. You are in control of the web. Why did people fall for that for so long? Because they were happy with the trade-off, right? The trade-off that Shoshana Zuboff describes as surveillance capitalism meant you give up all of your personal data, but now you get some convenience and connectivity, even when people knew that their whole...
And protection, right? That's also a promise.
Well, but at that time, it was really more about expanding forms of pleasure, hedonic, bliss, and kind of convenience and choice. So even when people knew, right, we all thought after the Snowden revelations, well, there goes the whole economic growth model, because now that people know that their ever last private thought is being just sold off to data brokers, not to mention given to the NSA, nobody's going to post the way they used to. Everyone for like a month put the tape over the webcam on their laptop and quietly took it off at some point.
Look at us now,
year.
mobile phones.
Yeah, right. So that compromise was actually acceptable to people because the trade-off, even entered in with some kind of knowledge, seemed to be something that was worthy of making. It was a social contract that was actually worthy of signing. The social contract of the LLM is very different, right? The social contract of AI says to the consumer, you must entirely back this project, even though if our predictions come true, and we are hoping that you agree to bank the entire future of the American economy on it, then you will be obsolescent within 5 years, right? That is a social contract that's a bit harder to put your name at the bottom of. But because people like Musk think that that's the only future that is possible, now the intrusion of disruptive politics, right, the intrusion of people into the platforms to push their own anti-tech politics is actually more of a concern than it ever was before. So if Black Lives Matter and Me Too were a problem, well, opposition to data centers and AI is even more of an existential risk for the kind of profit model that they hope to see going forward. So this contamination of the networks is now very much bound up with their fears of social unrest, economic stagnation, and ultimately becomes all an engineering problem. That's the thing we're trying to get across in our book, I think.
Okay. Well, so thank you so much. We're going to invite you to the stage.
Yes.
A warm applause, please.
Just after the Second World War in 1946, the British writer Aldous Huxley, here mostly known for his classic dystopian novel Brave New World, in a long, recently rediscovered essay called Science, Liberty and Peace, warned of what he called, in spirit, if not in exact phrase, the time of the oligarchs, an era in which immense technological power would accumulate in the hands of a few individuals who were not traditional royalty, not elected leaders, but something far stranger, private rulers of systems upon which millions depend. New technology, he predicted, would invade our private lives. And in the hands of the powerful elites, technology would render any resistance to their abuse of power futile. Though Huxley did not so much as predict our digital age, he proved prescient in predicting the rise of what he called the boy gangster, a type of ruler drunk on the new sense of power technology gives him, no longer constrained by the rules of liberal democracy. Reading Muskism, and I think it must be clear that you should read it if you haven't read it already. Reading Muskism, one cannot help but feel that Huxley's spectre has stepped out of the domain of pure speculation into the boardrooms, launch pads, and social media feeds of the 21st century. Muskism is, and it will be clear by now, not simply a book about Elon Musk. What the book attempts to grasp is the ideology or the accumulation of ideas or fancies, implicit, half articulated and often contradictory, that has formed around Musk's omnipresent public persona. What the authors call Muskism is not a coherent ideology, rather it's a cultural trajectory in which we easily recognize our own times, a mixture of techno-optimism, libertarian impatience, the promise of heroic individualism, and a near-religious, or maybe religious belief in the engineering as the ultimate solvent of political and moral dilemmas. Because of this, the public fascination with Musk is not so hard to understand. In a time when political institutions appear slow, compromised, and endlessly procedural, the image of a single individual who seems able to bend the future with sheer willpower has undeniable appeal. The message embedded in the various projects of Musk is seductive for many people who feel entitled and powerless at the same time. The future belongs not to committees, not to politicians, but to visionaries. At the same time, Musk has become the ultimate maverick, someone, and I think that's the difference with Peter Thiel, the ultimate maverick, someone who has fully embraced the chaotic but revolutionary insurgents against the old order. Muskism thrives in a cultural vacuum left by the erosion of shared political imaginations. Where earlier generations looked to public institutions, social movements, or democratic reforms to shape our future, today's technological culture increasingly places its hope in entrepreneurs that promise sovereignty for the individual. The traditional oligarch, as Huxley imagined him in his essay, was defined by wealth and influence over resources. The contemporary oligarch commands something more abstract and therefore more pervasive: platforms, infrastructures, and networks. The modern citizen may never vote for such a figure, yet their daily life, their communications, their mobility, and even their access to information may pass through systems designed or owned by them. In Muskism, this condition is described with a mixture of, shall I say, fascinations and unease. Elon Musk appears simultaneously as a symptom and as an agent of a broader transformation. His ambitions, colonizing Mars, we haven't mentioned that, transforming transportations, reshaping global communications, seem almost mythic. They invoke the 19th century industrial titans who imagined railways stretching across continents. But unlike those earlier magnates, Musk operates in a digital age in which the boundary between private ambitions and public infrastructure has grown increasingly porous. Musk presents himself as the protagonist of an unfolding story. Humanity stands at the brink of stagnation, bureaucracy, and planetary collapse, and only radical innovation can save it. Within this narrative, the entrepreneur becomes a kind of existential hero, or you could say a full-blown enabler of fascism. The appeal of this narrative is difficult to overstate, I think. It offers clarity in a world that often feels paralyzed by complexity. Climate change, geopolitical instability, economic inequality, those problems seem vast, systemic, and politically intractable. Muskism responds with a disarmingly simple propositions: build better machines. Electric cars will reduce emissions, rockets will open new worlds, artificial intelligence will solve problems too complex for mere human minds. And yet, as the book makes abundantly clear, such confidence risks becoming a form of technological messianism. The belief that engineering solutions can replace political judgment conceals the very dilemma it claims to solve. A society cannot be debugged like software. Human conflicts, inequalities, and values do not disappear simply because of a more efficient machine has been introduced. There is, of course, something very paradoxical about Musk's rhetoric of liberations. Muskism often frames itself as a rebellion against bureaucracy and stagnations, a call to free humanity from the slow machinery of institutions. Yet the infrastructures it creates, satellite networks, proprietary platforms, closed technological ecosystems, generate new forms of dependency, or we could even say enslavement. Freedom, in this sense, becomes intertwined with reliance on privately governed systems. Returning to Huxley's warnings about the time of the oligarchs, one realizes that the issue is not simply the wealth or influence of individuals like Musk. The deeper question concerns the narratives through which society interprets technological change. If innovation is framed exclusively as the achievement of heroic individuals or companies, then the collective dimension of progress, the public investments, scientific communities, and democratic decisions that make such breakthroughs possible faces from view. Muskism invites us to reconsider this imbalance. The future, the book implicitly argues, is a shared project, one that requires political deliberation as much as technological ingenuity. Rockets may eventually reach Mars, but the meaning of such journeys, who benefits, who decides, why it matters, remains a profoundly human question. Perhaps that is the lingering unease one feels after closing this book. Muskism captures a genuine aspiration, I think that was made clear, the desire to push beyond limitations and imagine bold possibilities. Yet it also reveals a cultural tendency to surrender the authority of the future to those who appear most capable of building it. Those who resist, those who criticize, will have to be eradicated like a virus. If Huxley foresaw the age of oligarchs, Muskism suggests that we are living in its technological variant, an era in which the builders of systems increasingly resemble the architects of destiny. The challenge for democratic societies is not to reject innovation, but to reclaim the broader conversation about what kind of future these innovations are meant to serve. Maybe the danger is not so much that there is such a thing as big tech. The danger is that many of us have come to believe the future belongs to it alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Bas. I want to go to you. Do you want to react, maybe?
I mean, thank you. I think I agree with what you're saying. I think that the distinction that I feel like someone like Huxley could not have anticipated is really this complete entanglement of everyday life with the sensors. I mean, when it was mentioned before, why do they go into the home? Why are they interested in self-driving cars? Well, sensors are cheap, and if you can actually capture a kind of full spectrum portrait of human life, then this provides the kind of possibilities for profit that someone like Huxley in 1944 could not possibly imagine. So how that turns into a kind of infrastructural power is, I think, something that allows for a different form of dictatorship, a different form of domination, right? This is something we've been really interested in, is that it's not a question of authoritarianism or fascism in the old model, where you put up a big picture of yourself and stand in front of a microphone and deliver a speech and everyone falls into line. One of the strangest things about watching Musk speak is how uncompelling he is, right? He's actually not a charismatic figure per se, but he's perfectly tuned to the era of the internet. So when he goes online, he doesn't actually often say things, he responds to people. And by doing so, he sort of enters into this algorithmic interaction that accumulates his message without his message being delivered in a one-way form. So it's a kind of, Citizen Kane for the age of AI and algorithms that I think even someone like Huxley would have been surprised to see as possible.
Yes, but Huxley made a point, earlier in Brave New World, in that he differs from Orwell, that people would come to love their own servitude, in a sense. And I think with the big tech firms, that's the first, what you described, the transaction. It was a sense of, we know what we give up, but we get something back of us, and as long I've nothing to hide. That was the phrase there. So in a sense, I think he did predict. Well, we're not talking about Huxley, but he did predict a kind of more that people would willing to give up a lot for that.
I think that's right, but it's important to acknowledge that we're now in a new technological paradigm. It's not as if surveillance capitalism has disappeared overnight. I think the dynamics that we've been describing persist, right? How Google makes most of its money is still through advertising revenue that's sold by monetizing personal data. But I think the inflection point around generative AI cannot be overstated, where, to give an example, what you're seeing in the United States now is an increasing incidence of protests around data center construction. And these are occurring particularly in rural counties, which typically vote very heavily for the Republican Party. It's widely expected that the approaching midterm elections will be the first election in which data centers are in fact a major political issue and increasingly look potentially like a liability for the Republican Party. And this is, I think, as Quinn alluded to in his earlier remarks, a very different kind of bargain being presented, where even the opportunity to love your own servitude because you're getting a certain endorphin hit, or you're like enjoying getting into a screaming match with a stranger on Twitter, that even those somewhat paltry pleasures are not available, because the proposition is that we're going to put in this football field in your backyard, your energy costs are going to go up, and also the explicit stated ambition, and people aren't stupid in these communities, they know, they've read the newspapers that explain this, is to put you and your family and your kids and your grandkids out of work forever.
And not only that, there's very little people working in the data centers.
It doesn't take that many people to operate a data center, so you can't sell the jobs.
But we have the same discussion in Amsterdam now, and the municipality elections are coming up. And the trade-off that political parties are making here, are saying that there is that more tech startups will come here because of all those cloud and machines and whatever, and therefore there will be more jobs. At least that's a promise.
Yeah. No, but the additional sales pitch of big tech is, look, we make, this is very Musk, we make you more sovereign because you get your own infrastructure. But basically, they find it difficult to build them now in the US. So they put their money elsewhere to make sure they have enough data centers. Anyway, this is a whole
Let's
debate
finally
you
go
can
to
have.
sovereignty, because
But how far is this reaction which you describe? I think this is a growing unease with it, but there's no movement, political very strong movement against it, or is it?
in the US or in Europe?
In the United States. I mean, they've succeeded, I think, in slowing down and thwarting some efforts. I think what will be interesting to watch is whether kind of national coalition emerges around this question that can coordinate. It has to coordinate across immense differences of geography, but also politics, because these are, for instance, to give an example, predominantly white conservative communities in some rural areas, but also, as a case that we discuss in the book, predominantly black communities, for instance, in a particular neighborhood of Memphis where XAI built its first data centers, who tend to have a very different politics. So there's coalitional work that has to be constructed, but at a local level, it's becoming quite salient.
Okay. Well, let's still move to sovereignty. In the book, there are 4 futures or 4 versions of the future that you describe. So you have CO2 Musk, Musk as a state supplier, compound Musk, and cyborg Musk. And I want to focus on, because of time, on Musk and the role of the state supplier. Because what I found interesting is what we've been talking about is that there's a symbiotic relationship between the government and Musk, right? And the government and tech oligarchs. And then we usually talk about what does this do to sovereignty? And I want to move towards maybe not how can we stop Musk, but what are things that we can do to maybe not have a Muskism future alone? I want to go to Loka first.
Yeah, it is not surprising. A lot of the internet was started by the government, by DARPA, so a lot of things Musk did was started with public money, and it is normally warfare is the prerogative of the state. But here, you can't have a war anymore without all the private infrastructure. It's a bit like our VOC start, where the ships the merchants were also allowed to make war, and for a good reason we split out those powers. So yes, it is a complete mix of private-public, which makes you very dependent, especially if it's all foreign. So for Europe, that is really an issue, and if that is the sovereignty debate what you're pointing at. And we will need to become, at least to have a multi-supplier vendor policy. We don't need to become autarkic, but we need to have some alternatives. And, well, they're all looking at it, but it is very difficult because now the tech stack has become so intertwined. So I think for a long time the US was felt like Europe to be completely aligned in values. Well, by now, and with your book, that helps, I think, for a lot of people. We are not, no longer. And the question is, what does this all mean for us as Europe? What should our policy be? I have a question for you, being Americans. For me, it is
Canadian,
yeah. No, but you're closer to the fire. Why is Trump and Musk and everybody so focused on Europe? You would expect them to at least, well, not say, oh, we're your partner, but ignore us a bit because we are partners. Why are they so focused on? I have my own theory, but I would love to hear why they're singling out Europe to undermine what is going here.
Let me try to answer the first question and the second question at the same time.
Okay.
I think that, this question of state supplier Musk or contractor Musk is maybe an opportunity to kind of decenter Musk again and think about another text, actually, The Technological Republic by Alexander Karp, which is interesting because it gives us a sense of kind of Muskism without Musk. If you read that book, then you see that there's actually no offer of the hedonic pleasures of the early 2000s. There's no individual choice or the kind of the freedom of consumption.
Yeah.
There's definitely no discussion of democracy or sovereignty or deliberation or self-determination. What there is the conjuring of a world of risks and a world of great dangers, adversaries, competitors, rivals that you need to be defended from by plugging your confidence into Palantir's products. Alexander Karp's the co-founder of Palantir, and then Palantir itself needs to plug into the federal government. So the horizon of politics is about safety, it's about security, rather than anything productive like growth over time, progress. So it's a very defensive approach that someone like Karp took in that book. The punchline is that he wrote that book not for Trump, but with the expectations of a Kamala Harris administration. Why? Because that was the direction of travel of the Democratic Party, actually, for much of the Biden administration. It was transforming a question of green capitalism into anti-China containment and isolation. It was using the tools of sanctions, export controls, to try to cut off advanced AI chips in their export to China. So that the hardening of the borders of the state was actually a cross-partisan consensus in the last 20 years or so. Yeah. The idea of increasing opposition to immigration has been a cross-party consensus. Obama was known as the deporter-in-chief, right? He was doing a huge amount of deportation of people. So the advantage, we think, of the shock moment of Musk is that it actually allows for a potential wake-up call also and a realignment for the left and for the Democratic Party itself. We have seen how things like the reaction to the incursions in Minneapolis have changed public opinion around things like ICE, around things like immigration, policing quite quickly at a national scale. It's not just a local question. Yeah. So I think that's the first thing to say is that, this Muskism without Musk exists. In a way, it was what the Democratic and Republican Party have been running on for the last 10 years. So it's not just a question of, again, getting Trump out of the White House and everything returns back to something that was wonderful. Very briefly on the Europe question, I mean, this is a fixation, as we know, of J.D. Vance, especially. It's part of the SOP to the paleo-conservative far-right part of the Republican coalition, which sees Europe as having been, contaminated by immigrants. The Great Replacement. Wokeism is the mild way of putting it, right? I mean, the Great Replacement theory, long seen as something that only people on the furthest far right in the identitarian movement in Europe would entertain, is now posted on the official accounts of all of the government agencies almost
Quinn,
daily.
Don't you think, I see it's not just MAGA or whatever, or Republicans, it's Democrats also thinking Europe has been complacent, is, 600 Europeans asking 350 million US people to defend Europe against 140 million Russians. They think we are free riders, we are lazy.
I think that maybe there's a bit too much of a blurring of the two administrations' approaches there, right? I mean, I think Caroline de Gruyter, I think, is either just come or she's coming. I mean, she's the real person to ask this question to. But I think that the notion that the EU needed to contribute more to defense and had to change the balance of military spending is not a reactionary viewpoint per se, right? There is some objective value to that argument.
Absolutely. I'm not disputing
it's the cultural argument that I think distinguishes MAGA and Musk. And Musk takes it through the programming metaphors and the engineering metaphors that see immigrants as vectors of basically bad code, right? You need to, they are. You can't think of politics in a way in which, if people are voting center or left, it's because the politicians speak better to their material interests. People are voting center or left because the society has been contaminated by viruses in the form of immigrants. Once you remove those immigrants, then you'll return back to a natural right-wing form of nationalism. So that, he speaks that language of sort of cyber exclusionism, and that lines up with the more civilizational language of people like Vance and company.
But I think the source of your question was also what accounts for the contempt that the American
and it
right
feels
has for
quite
Europe.
broad. It's not just Republicans. That was my point.
And I think
do you recognize it?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and I think there's a reason for it, which is that Musk and many other figures in the American right, including very much people within the Trump White House, see Europe as the ancestral source of white Christian civilization, as their cultural, genetic, and racial homeland. But
we're wasting it.
Precisely. And that's where the contempt comes in, that they've squandered that by losing their way through overly permissive immigration policies, by multiculturalism, diluting their cultural legacy. So I think that accounts for the specific rage, that it's not just a vassal that's been disobedient, but rather a ancestral homeland that has contaminated itself and therefore needs to be restored to further glory under the patronage of a white Christian nationalist regime in the United States.
Yeah.
Well, that's very, I have a question that's very ideological, but there's also an element in Muskism, I would say, that is a kind of willful irresponsibility. That is very exciting to a lot of people. But if we see what happens in Iran at the moment, a kind of half invasion or bombardment without any real strategy, it's a kind of improvising kind of culture, almost game-like, I could say. That is also very much part of the whole image of Muskism, of the sense of willful, we don't care what happens, we'll just try. If the rocket explodes, well, we build a new one. That's, I think you described that. And that's for a lot of people, that's very attractive. Could you explain that? Because when it's actually like Doge, when it really has to perform or really to deliver, it fails as a kind of real instrument of change. It's kind of almost like it's like, a kind of just fantasies. And if it hits your heart, if you hit your head hard on reality, we'll try something new. Mm-hmm. Is that an element you recognize, especially with Musk, with this kind of maverick?
Sure.
Yeah, I think you could see this current war as a kind of Silicon Valley war in a couple of ways. One is interesting, as you point out, as a kind of, fail faster. You can do an iterative relationship to warfare without having a sense of any constraints. But more concretely, what we know now from reporting is it's really the first conflict where AI is being used extensively for the identification of targets. So what had taken up to 6 months in the past to drop the same amount of payload that has now been dropped within 2 weeks, because the chain of command now, rather than going through people and paper, is going through actually the Palantir Maven operating system is being queried to find the targets, which are then automatically carried through on. Mm-hmm. So that is, certainly a sign of the automation of conflict with the impression of efficiency or optimization, but actually a kind of naivety about what it takes to, transform a government or, let alone win the sympathy of the people whose country you're destroying. So there's a kind of mismatch there between the tech, which is supposed to be the solution, and then the problem of governance, which always eludes.
Well, that's the same that Musk experiences, because he has
Absolutely.
this belief,
Yeah.
and then suddenly, there's this woke virus. So it's this. It's a kind of almost, but you call it naivete. But is that the word? Is it people who are so smart, can they be so naive? Well, I think they can, but...
If the world has rewarded them by making them the most rich person who ever walked on it, then they can be understood for thinking that they have got something right that other people have got wrong, right? So whatever kind of delusion they have is the world's most lucrative delusion. In that sense, I think our attempt is to penetrate into that topsy-turvy world and understand how its laws of physics seem to operate.
I want to add, because when I read the book, there's a sentence that struck me, and I think it really adds to this conversation, and that is, under Muskism, the civil servant is a transitional species. State reform is a bridge to a new regime of algorithmic sovereignty in which consent and legitimacy are replaced by the consistency of machine governance.
Yeah, I think if you want to see a very concrete illustration of that, I would encourage everyone to look for a video of this Maven system operating, you can actually find it online. This is the system that Quinn alluded to, which uses both Palantir and Anthropic's technology to provide a new kind of targeting system for the U.S. military. It's how they've been able to hit vastly more targets in the Iranian conflict than they have in previous conflicts. And it looks quite like a video game. I mean, to return to your question, essentially uses a kind of overlays of various maps to be able to process information very rapidly and identify targets for strikes. But, if we think about Baudrillard and the Gulf War and all of these theories about, the Gulf War didn't really happen because it was mediated through these types of technologies, we're so much further down that road where the people who are responsible for pressing the button are increasingly delegating core parts of that kill chain, as it's described, to machines itself. So even in the last year, that process has accelerated quite dramatically. And I think that has a bearing in all of the themes we've discussed tonight. Obviously, the further digitization and cyborgization of reality, that's not the delusion of one man, that's happening.
It's happening.
He's a lens that helps us understand that, but that's not in his head. And also state symbiosis, because as we saw in the fight between Anthropic and the Pentagon, the U.S. military, the strongest in the world, is increasingly dependent on these handful of small providers for the exercise of core sovereign functions like war making. So it's also an intensification, I think, of state symbiosis.
So is the Netherlands. There was just in Follow the Money, there were journalists who did research, and they said that the police as well as the army is now using Palantir. They are not saying that they are, but the journalists have found initiations.
They are.
They are.
No, look, gloom and doom. Huh? It doesn't. So I'm optimistic by nature. I read all the history of new technologies. It looked pretty gloom. In the first revolutions, we managed to grab back some form of control over this type of companies where they're breaking them up. Anyway, legislators are always behind, and I haven't given up. But if you were Europe, what would your recommendation be to us? I have some thoughts myself.
But maybe start with your thoughts, and then we go to them. I prefer that.
Yeah.
You prefer that? Oh, okay. Well, look, there is misuse of data and the platforms that is quite universally frowned upon. Like, I don't know, making you on purpose addicted to scrolling, or, all types of tricks to keep you there. Or get your consent by devious ways, or not honoring consent, or tinkering with the algorithm in such a way that suddenly Musk's feed is coming everywhere. And, I know the US public doesn't like it either. And I think that is one of the instead of focusing on our supervisory authorities, focusing on I don't know, procedural rules, etc., focus fully on and combine with Australia, the UK, Canada, to go after those violations. That would be a thing I would do. That is on the EU level. Another thing is that I don't see the benefit, you can kill me for it, but the benefit of X at all if I see what is. I see our media still being on it, NRC, a leading newspaper, still our politicians complaining about X on X. Do you see? I mean, let's just cut the oxygen. So this is the policy level, then it is what you can do as companies, etc. And then on the personal level, I think we should, instead of complain about big tech, get our own stuff and move to other alternatives that are European. This is basically very simple, something I would do that we all can do today. I think we also need to think about our democracy, where people feel they have a lot of power and should be heard, and then have the traditional democracy. I think we need to change some infrastructure there too, and then not by voting everybody, because then it's a swarm voting for, and then it is completely the mind of today, do you see? But I don't know, groups of people being consulted on certain topics. Anyway, I have lots of ideas, but I would like to hear yours. I mean, I know my own ideas.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just say something quickly, and I think Ben has more expertise in the interface between actual existing technology and ideas. But we think that there right now seem to be sort of three alternatives that are being thought about. One you could see of as just regulation, which is already the characteristic of the EU attitude towards internet and tech governance, right? Use the products, but overlay them with forms of content moderation and privacy security. When Musk turns X into a child sexual abuse material generator, as he did earlier this year, to try to get the user numbers up so that he can increase the value of the company before he merges it with XAI and thus into SpaceX ahead of the IPO, invade the offices of X in Paris, right? Talk about new investigations, levy fines, the way the European Commission has done for algorithmic manipulation. So that's all I think good. The fact that it's angering Musk is a good sign, right? Yeah. He's getting angry, then something hurts. At least is right.
It hurts.
The other option would be, replication. So often it's discussed as simply a question of creating clones of existing services. So they have Microsoft Teams. Now you make the French version of that. You move from X to Blue Sky. You move from one version to the other.
WhatsApp to Signal.
Yeah, right. You replace SpaceX, which has 10,000 satellites in low Earth orbit, with Eutelsat, which has about 600, but with plans to greatly increase them. And
it will increase.
Not something that takes forever, actually, right?
No.
One of the good things about being the second mover is someone else has already figured out the tech, so you can actually just copy it. But the third one, and this is where I would like to hand it off to Ben, because he has interesting thoughts on this, is reinvention. So rather than just replicating the capital wage relation that has been built into tech with a new thing with a French name and French capitalists or Dutch capitalists at its head instead of American capitalists, still getting investment from Bezos or the Saudi Public Investment Fund and the Norwegian Oil Fund, and effectively replicating the same structures of domination and oppression that exist in Silicon Valley.
If you have complaints about hyperscalers, you will have complaints about European.
So that alone can't solve the core problem. So we think that some kind of reinvention of the relationship between tech and society is maybe better.
That's the big question.
Well, that's where Ben's going to head.
I would like to intrude for a moment. Is because all the solutions you propose are more or less practical, or defensive, and I think you need a narrative which is more. The values that Nick Bostrom was talking about,
real Bostromism has never been tried.
We should redefine them in a way that it becomes more attractive, or so we should criticize in an intelligent way, but offer something as an alternative to this world, which is very addictive. I think the excitement of Musk. We're talking about Musk. We're not talking about Ursula von der Leyen for 2 hours. But where she stands for we should be. We cannot only be defensive about democracy or about liberal values. If we can be critical about them, but it's not. So I think that's the thing. I think Musk will. Well, that's my prediction. Because he's so. It's not a. His ideology is very fluent, like modern times. So he will appear or be strong or disappear. He's not a. I think he's very. Captive to a kind of the moment. So maybe people in 5 years, I hope your book will be sold out many times, then would say, Musk, he's a relic of that can happen. Yeah. He's not so young anymore. And I think his behavior becomes more erratic. So I think so in a way, I think it will all end quite badly. I think the solutions will not help very much, but it will run its course. But if you don't offer anything against it in a kind of convincing way, there will be some new kind of semi-technological fascist kind of movement.
Yeah, so the alternative is if we move it to Europe, we'll have a European Musk. Is that what you're saying?
Well, if I'm allowed to say, the revolt against liberal democracy is from the left. It says they're hypocrites because they promised us equality and they didn't deliver, and for the right says the radical right says, well, people were never equal anyway. So they were hypocrites because they didn't see human nature as it is, and we embrace it fully. That is the narratives we have to deal with.
So we're back to Orwell.
Well, I haven't. I hear what you say, and you fundamentally you're right, but I haven't given up, and I think.
But it's not only if you say it's a question of regulation.
No,
I don't
believe me. We have all the rules we need to fight whatever
We
is
have
out
too many,
there.
even sometimes maybe.
Well, you have to find
we have
people to
more than
believe in the
enough.
rules.
No new rules. It is about target.
Well, the
enforcement.
reinvention, which I was supposed to be my handoff, my co-author here, but something happened. I'm not sure where.
Yeah.
I think when thinking about this issue, there's often a temptation to descend too quickly to practical matters. Like, why can't we just build the app that solves the problem? That's actually always the easiest part. It's real, especially now with Claude Code.
I agree.
It's really not hard to build an app. And even before that, there's always software engineers who want to do something virtuous, and you can recruit them to your cause. The hard part is actually upstream. And it's worth reflecting on the fact that one of the vectors of power of Silicon Valley, one of the ways it exercises authority over people's lives, is precisely over the question of imagination, that they set the parameters of what is imaginable technologically, that we've been living within their walled gardens for so long that it's difficult for us to perceive that very different possibilities exist. We've talked about how Musk helps us clarify the extent to which certain assumptions about human behavior are embedded into these technologies. That, I think, also gives us an opportunity to reimagine how those technologies could be reconstructed with a very different set of values. So I think our answer to this question of what should Europe do, not that we're exactly the experts on this question, but that we perhaps selfishly would like Europeans to take this as an opportunity to develop a different technological paradigm that can be an inspiration to people around the world.
Exactly.
Because when we get into questions of sovereignty, of like, okay, how do we get European digital sovereignty to combat this type of sovereignty? We get very quickly into questions of nationalism. And I want to restore a spirit of internationalism, that actually we live, despite these deglobalizing currents, in an interconnected world where people can inspire one another transnationally.
I want to give one example where we try. And it is never, it's then suddenly not just technological. You need everybody to rally around the flag. We are building now a large Dutch language model based on Dutch, but it requires it requires all the publishers to go along and invest so they can get a real compensation. So rather than just scraping, violating privacy, violating copyrights, we're trying to turn it around in a different system, and it's actually working. And I haven't given up there at all. And then you suddenly see that all the people who are now out of a job, it can get an LLM that maybe actually help them in their job, but is not, and
maybe,
they get, we'll see, we'll see. But I think the creativity in our news will never be completely automated. That is truly what I think.
I mean, when you think about the themes that we've been discussing thus far, just to be very concrete, state symbiosis, rapid digitization, one idea would be you could try to construct a technological paradigm that achieve very different outcomes along those dimensions than we've been describing thus far. So if state symbiosis is this broader story of how states have reduced their independent capacity by relying more heavily on monopoly providers, that is a set of political choices that reflect certain assumptions, certain ideological beliefs about the superior efficiency of the private sector. You could make a different choice and say, actually, we want to build up the independent capacity of the public sector because public power is qualitatively different than private power, precisely in the sense that it can be accountable to a democratic polity. That is a very different model of technological innovation.
I think it is a different model from what has been suddenly being developed. But let's face it, if you look at history, I mean, I'm not telling, but it started with, we got for all public infrastructure. We made rules and we regulate it. Our waterways are interoperable, the rails are interoperable and regulated. Our telco industry is. And I tell you, the cloud infrastructure it is regaining control over those that we didn't realize were actually public infrastructures. This is what is happening.
Isn't it
Last short reaction, and then I want to go to the audience, because we've been talking far too long.
I don't want to be the pessimist here, but it seems a very formidable challenge. And
it is.
We have
it
to
is.
realize
that, it is.
Well, Peter Thiel wrote, after the re-election of Donald Trump, he wrote a piece for I think, Financial Times, which is very strange kind of, and he said, it was a battle of the elites fought against the internet, and the internet won. That's his point of view. And maybe that's not true in the way you can change a lot, but there is a kind of radical, it's very hard, you can regulate a lot, but there's also a kind of freedom of the internet, or that's very hard to contain, I think, and makes things very subjective. Like Musk did, he starts off with Grok as a kind of sense but then he infuses it with his own ideas, which becomes an ideological tool, basically. So I think it's very hard to regulate this kind of new world order or disorder we live in. So, but it helps to realize the challenges, so I agree with that, but I'm not so optimistic about.
There's a new internet being built, the SEAL network, and there may be alternatives.
Sentence, point. Yeah. Sorry. We're going to go to the audience for questions. Does anyone have a question?
Behind you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, I am definitely not very visible.
It's okay. We're going to hold it. It's part of the service. No, we hold it. It's okay.
Okay. So just two quick questions. I think I still prefer to hold it, sorry, or at least a bit further away. So first question, there is a very interesting article by, I think the author was called Srivastava, and she looks at the East India Company and its relation to the British Empire, a bit as a reference to what you mentioned. Yeah. And at some point she finds that the British Empire felt very annoyed by the East India Company and the way it overstepped. It somehow reined in and tried to get control back. So do you see any possibility, looking at the US and its corporations, for the state to actually reconsider its dependence? First question. And second, very quick question. I actually work on cloud policy in the EU and data center movements, etc. And I was very optimistic. So the Netherlands, indeed, one of the first countries with resistance to data centers, etc. If you look at the current Cloud and AI Development Act, most of the submissions, both by EU businesses and US businesses, actually agree on the necessity to build more data centers and to decrease environmental regulations. There are arguments between them about public procurement and stuff that are, okay, they quarrel, they have different interests. But on this fundamental issue, they are very much in agreement. And it seems that these data center movements in Europe from many countries actually have failed to achieve a lot. Businesses actually lobby for governments to re-centralize decision-making and to show local governments what the benefits of AI
Okay, I'm going to cut you off there.
So, my question is, how do we see reimagining also from social movements from below if we have such powerful business groups also in Europe?
Okay, thank you.
Maybe I'll take the first one and hand the second one to Ben. It's a great example, actually, because it allows us to do something, I think, which we want to do, which is to avoid an easy answer for the left, which is often just like nationalize everything, right? Like nationalize the data centers, nationalize Facebook, nationalize OpenAI. The story you're referring to happens in the 19th century. And in 1857, there is an Indian rebellion, the uprising of many parts of the then subcontinent governed by the British East India Company. And the British Empire says this is not working as private corporate governance. We are now going to formally absorb the subcontinent into the British Empire. So that's the creation of the Indian Raj. We're going to build out the occupying force. So it's mostly, white officers instead of using indigenous officers. And we're going to impose actually a much harsher form of colonial rule. So that is not actually an inspiring example, right? I mean, in that case, it means the brutal enforcement of public authority over private authority. And arguably this moment in the last month between Pete Hegseth and Dario Amodei at Anthropic is a kind of moment like that. Like, how far can the British East India Company go to set the agenda? And when is the Crown going to step in and say, like, no, it has to be like this, or else we're removing all of your profits. So I think, we need to also not be naive to think that the more state, the better or something. It really depends which state we're talking about. And in fact, there is some virtue, arguably, for the private sector and its ability to have its own strike against certain decision-making of the kind we just saw. So maybe that's my answer to the first part.
Second question?
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to give you a formula of how to kickstart the resistance to data centers in Europe, I'm afraid. But I mean, an observation from the case in the States, perhaps an anodyne observation of how politics generally works, is that different people in different communities have different interests that need to be spoken to very concretely. So when you look at the opposition to data centers in the United States, in some cases, it's about the fear around rising energy bills and the cost of living crisis and affordability, which is a major theme and a major crisis in American society. In some cases, it comes out of environmental and ecological concerns. In some cases, people literally don't want it in their backyard. It would be like ugly to look at this big, weird building in some beautiful rural county. In some cases, it comes out of broader concerns about what AI will do to their children and their grandchildren's job prospects. So I think the kind of hard work of politics in places where this has been successful in the United States is building, at least at this moment at a local level, coalitions that can kind of fuse all of these interests across these lines of difference of race, geography, and politics into something that has a common goal.
Thank you. Is there another question here?
Thanks a lot. This has been fantastic. We could go on for hours, I think. So my question is, so where does Muskism stand on this spectrum between, let's say, globalism on the one end and then economic nationalism or techno-nationalism on the other? And in that Muskist world or future, would China be a partner, a competitor, or a systemic rival?
Again, I think it splits perfectly there. I mean, one of our attractions to the South African model, which we could have spoken more of if, given more time and that we fill out more in the book, is that it itself offered a kind of third way between what you describe at the time. So late apartheid South Africa was neither American-led global capitalism nor, Soviet-style command economy socialism. It used some of the access available through being plugged into the world market, got licenses to build out its own auto sector, Ford, Datsun. It took licenses for technology from IBM. It managed to build out its own nuclear sector, but in the interest of self-sufficiency and a relative level of defensive autonomy. So we see that as being the Musk model. And at his best, at his most successful, he's been able to sell that to different partners, right? We use the example of the Gigafactory. When he was faced with this moment that the United States and China were trying to decouple from each other and were building higher and higher tariff walls and kind of difficulties for export across that border, he had a choice. He could either sell his technology to the Chinese or he could sell it to the Americans, and he chose both. Right, so the Gigafactory did economic nationalist work for China, and it did economic nationalist work for the United States, and it did economic nationalist work for Germany and the EU, helped them achieve their dreams of green capitalist transition. So that's, I think, our argument, is it doesn't operate, definitely not through the globalism mediated through multilateral trade treaties in which states give up a part of their sovereignty to have access to larger markets. But it doesn't also make a scalar choice, either the world or the nation. It actually works by choosing different scales all the way down to the household, which through Tesla's ecosystem of products becomes more self-sufficient, hardened, and less reliant on public infrastructure and grids.
Yeah, we just add that when Musk starts to identify most...
I'm going to ask to give a bit of a shorter answer,
yeah,
so you can do one more.
I'll go very fast. When Musk becomes more closely identified with Trump, this sales pitch doesn't work as well, because he's no longer seen as a reliable partner to the Chinese, to the Europeans in their pursuit of national energy independence.
That was short. Wow, sorry.
That was real short.
Is there one more
China.
question?
The
last one. I can see one there. Yeah,
that's better. Hi, thank you for me as well for the very enlightening discussion. I had one question. We've been talking a lot about Musk as a single individual, a single visionary, a maverick, as Mr. Heine says. And I was wondering if you can tell me a bit more about the interaction between Musk and his companies. In what kind of framework does he operate? Is he truly the sole initiator, or are there multiple voices? Which leads to a second brief question, because it's very brief. Very brief. It seems to me like the appeal of Musk is at an all-time low at the moment. He's been kicked out of Doge. Gen Z seems to hate him. He makes a very unflattering appearance in the Epstein files. Can they boot him? Can they do it without him, or is he too important?
Well, I mean, far from wanting to boot him, they just offered him the biggest compensation package in history, right? And as for his falling star, I mean, later this year, the SpaceX IPO should happen at a value of $1.75 trillion. So arguably, he's going nowhere but up right now. And certainly for his investors and those ones who had early equity stakes who want to cash out and exit at the moment of an IPO, right? There's an incredible amount of reliance, actually, on the charismatic quality of Musk to precisely tell those stories about the future that don't necessarily always come exactly true, but they show a kind of a direction of the investment growth narrative that if you align yourself with that, so far, just based on past performance, you can actually be probably pretty confident that you'll be able to cash out. So his forward motion, I think, still has that orientation quality. Maybe Ben can say something about how he works in the companies.
Yeah, I would also just add, we've had this question a lot over the past several events, is that what happens after Musk. And I think it's really the intervention of our book to say that Muskism is likely to persist, that the kind of developments that he's made an ensemble of, deglobalization, digitization, and so forth, are likely to continue in one form or another. They might be put into a different ensemble. We're not trying to make an inevitability argument, and certainly I think there is room for a political response. But Muskism, I think, as we diagnose it, is likely to continue in one form or another. I think on the question of how he organizes his companies, I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of a classic Silicon Valley approach of the sort that Peter Thiel describes in 0 to 1. Peter Thiel describes it classically as a monarchy, in which you have a founder CEO who is a king-like figure, who is able to act quickly and decisively because his decisions are not mediated through a bureaucracy of corporate management. So it tends toward a flatter organizational structure in which managers are reduced, now increasingly through the use of AI tools, and engineers are optimized for. So an army of engineers who are taking direction from a single monarch CEO figure is kind of the ideal form of the Muskist organization.
Okay, thank you. We're going to leave it here. I want to thank you both for honoring us and welcome and coming here. I want to thank you as well. I want to thank our technicians and as well as the audience for being here on a Sunday morning. I want to add that their book is being sold here at the entrance. You might maybe get a signature. I don't know.
Yeah, happy to.
I don't want to force you. And on the 16th of April, we're going to do another Tech Tankers on Palantir. So this adds to discussion. Thank you all so much and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.